For 100 years, every museum in America had the dire wolf wrong. Not a little wrong, not a minor labeling mistake. Fundamentally, scientifically, bone deep wrong. And the strange part is, nobody could have caught the mistake just by looking at the skeleton because the skeleton was the trap. It looked so much like a gray wolf that generations of paleontologists simply assumed it was a bigger, meaner cousin of the wolf you might see in Yellowstone today. Then scientists cracked open its DNA, and the story fell apart in the best possible way. This is the real history of the dire wolf, the parts almost nobody outside of paleontology circles actually knows. The story does not begin in a museum. It begins on the banks of the Ohio River near Evansville, Indiana, in the summer of 1854. The river was unusually low that year, nearly 11 feet lower than normal, and a local man named Francis Link was walking the exposed riverbed when he found a strange fossilized jawbone lodged in the mud near the mouth of Pigeon Creek. Link did not know what he had. He was not a scientist. He held on to the bone, and according to the record, he actually refused to let it be sent off for study. It was only after he died just weeks later on August 28th, 1854, that his family agreed to hand it over to a geologist named Joseph Norwood, who shipped it to Philadelphia to a doctor and anatomist named Joseph Leidy. Leidy was, at the time, the most respected vertebrate paleontologist in the country, the same man who would later identify the first nearly complete dinosaur skeleton ever found in North America, a creature called Hadrosaurus. When the Indiana jawbone landed on his desk, Leidy recognized immediately that the teeth did not belong to any living species. He described it that same year, initially naming it Canis primavus. There was just one problem. That name was already taken by a wolf-like Asian canine called the dhole. So in 1858, Leidy renamed his fossil Canis dirus, dire wolf, dreadful wolf, and the name stuck. Here's something almost nobody realizes. The dire wolf was not discovered in Los Angeles. It was not discovered at the Brea Tar Pits at all. That famous connection came decades later. In 1908, a paleontologist named John Campbell Merriam began pulling bone fragments out of the asphalt seeps in Los Angeles, and by 1912, there was enough material to formally confirm these were the same species Leidy had named half a century earlier from a single jawbone in Indiana. From that point on, La Brea became the dire wolf stage, and it delivered in a way almost no other fossil site on Earth has ever matched. Researchers have since pulled more than 4,000 individual dire wolves out of that tar. 4,000. That makes the dire wolf one of the single best represented large carnivores in the entire fossil record, anywhere on the planet, for any extinct species. For comparison, some entire dinosaur species are known from a handful of bones. The dire wolf has thousands of skulls. And this is where the confusion really took root, because with all those skulls sitting side by side with gray wolf skulls, they looked almost identical, slightly bigger, more robust, a heavier jaw, a larger crest of bone anchoring bigger chewing muscles, more crushing power in the back teeth. But visually, the two animals seemed like close relatives, maybe even direct ancestor and descendant. For over 100 years, that assumption sat undisturbed in textbooks and museum placards. Paleontologists debated details, but almost nobody questioned the basic premise that dire wolves and gray wolves were close kin. Getting usable DNA out of a dire wolf fossil turned out to be brutally difficult, and this part of the story rarely gets told. Tar seeps are chemically hostile environments, as one Oxford researcher who worked on the eventual DNA study put it. The tar pit is a hot, bubbly mess, and that does not do very nicely for DNA preservation. So even though La Brea handed scientists thousands of dire wolf bones, most of those bones were genetic dead ends. A researcher named Angela Perry spent years chasing alternatives, physically road tripping across the United States by bus, rental car, and plane, visiting museum drawers and university collections from coast to coast, collecting bone fragments from sites with better preservation conditions just to gather enough raw material for a real genetic analysis. The breakthrough finally came together in a landmark study published in the journal Nature in January of 2021. Researchers sequenced genetic material from 5 dire wolf individuals ranging from around 13,000 to 50,000 years old, pulled from multiple sites across the Americas. What they found rewired the entire family tree. Dire wolves were not close relatives of gray wolves. They were not close relatives of coyotes either. Genetically, the two lineages had been separated for an enormous stretch of time, with estimates placing the split somewhere between 5 and 6 million years ago. Some analyses pushing it out toward 5.7 million years. To put that in perspective, modern humans and chimpanzees split off from a common ancestor around 6 or 7 million years ago. The genetic distance between a dire wolf and a gray wolf is in that same neighborhood. These were not cousins. They were closer to distant relatives who happened to converge on a similar body plan because they were solving the same evolutionary problem, hunting big Ice Age herbivores, using the same basic toolkit. The dire wolf's closest living genetic relatives, as strange as this sounds, turned out to be African jackals, not the gray wolves and domestic dogs it lived alongside in North America for tens of thousands of years. Lead researcher Angela Perry described the animal that emerged from this new understanding as something closer to a giant reddish coyote than a true wolf. That description matters because artistic reconstructions have since shifted. Paleo artists working with the research teams now depict dire wolves with reddish or tawny coats rather than the gray shading you would expect on a typical wolf, a detail that came directly out of this genetic reassessment and quietly overturned decades of illustration in field guides and museum murals. There is another detail from that same study that rarely makes it into the popular retellings, and it might be the most important one biologically. The researchers found zero evidence that dire wolves ever interbred with gray wolves or coyotes, despite living side by side across the same continent for roughly 100,000 years. Modern wolves, coyotes, and dogs hybridize with each other fairly readily even today. Dire wolves apparently could not. They were genetically isolated enough, evolutionarily speaking, that even when gray wolves and dire wolves stood on the same riverbank, hunting the same herds, there was no genetic mixing happening between them. One researcher on the project noted that this isolation meant hybridization simply could not provide an evolutionary escape hatch for the dire wolf the way it has for some other struggling species throughout history. When the extinction pressure came, there was no genetic lifeline available because Leidy's original name, Canis dirus, had classified the animal within the genus Canis, the same genus as gray wolves, coyotes, and domestic dogs. The 2021 genetic findings forced a formal taxonomic correction. Scientists resurrected an older classification, one that had actually been proposed back in 1918 by Merriam himself, placing the species in its own separate genus entirely, Enossian, a name built from Greek roots meaning terrible wolf. The animal officially known in modern taxonomy today is Enossian dirus, not Canis dirus. For 100 years, the common name was basically a misnomer sitting in plain sight in every natural history museum in the country, and virtually nobody questioned it because the bones lied so convincingly. Now here is a piece of dire wolf geography that almost never comes up outside specialist circles. Everyone associates the species with the American Southwest, and the Brea Tar Pits specifically. but dire wolf fossils have turned up across a stunningly wide range, including well outside the United States entirely. Remains have been recovered as far south as Bolivia and Venezuela in South America, meaning the species pushed deep into the southern hemisphere long before humans ever set foot there. On the opposite end of the map, in 2020, researchers announced something that upended assumptions about the species' cold tolerance. A fossilized jaw fragment recovered from an underwater sand mining site near Harbin in northeastern China was identified as belonging to a dire wolf, dated to roughly 40,000 years old. That would make it the very first dire wolf fossil ever found outside the Americas, discovered thousands of miles from Los Angeles in a landscape that also hosted woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. It suggests dire wolves followed migrating prey animals across the Bering land bridge into Asia, something researchers previously assumed the cold and ice sheets made impossible, since almost no dire wolf fossils had ever turned up above the 42nd parallel in North America. Some researchers have pushed back on the Chinese identification, arguing the specimen is ambiguous, but if confirmed, it rewrites the northern boundary of where this animal was capable of surviving. There is also a genuinely charming footnote involving a museum basement in Canada. A fossilized jawbone sat quietly uncatalogued for years in the Royal Ontario Museum's collections, recovered originally from bluffs along the South Saskatchewan River near Medicine Hat, Alberta. During pandemic lockdowns, researcher Ashley Reynolds went back through old, under-examined specimens in the museum's holdings and formally identified the jaw as belonging to a dire wolf. It turned out to be the first confirmed dire wolf ever found in Canada, and the northernmost confirmed dire wolf specimen in North America by roughly 500 kilometers over the previous record holder, sitting unrecognized in a drawer the whole time. So, what did these animals actually eat, and how did they hunt? This is another area where the popular picture, largely shaped by their brief pop culture fame as fictional pets on Game of Thrones, does not match what the fossil evidence shows. Chemical analysis of bone collagen, called stable isotope analysis, lets researchers reconstruct an animal's diet even tens of thousands of years after death by measuring the ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes locked into the bone. Multiple isotope studies on La Brea specimens point to a diet dominated by large hoofed herbivores, particularly ancient horses and bison, along with camels and, less frequently, ground sloths. Researchers have estimated the dire wolf's typical prey size fell somewhere between roughly 300 and 600 kilograms in the same broad range as an adult bison. A pack of gray wolves today can and does bring down adult moose, animals that weigh around 500 kilograms, so a coordinated dire wolf pack tackling a bison is entirely plausible from a pure body mechanics standpoint. Isotope evidence from other sites tells slightly different stories. At a cave site in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, dire wolves appear to have relied heavily on an extinct type of peccary, a pig relative rather than bison or horses, showing that the species adjusted its menu depending on whatever large animals were locally abundant, rather than specializing narrowly on one type of prey. There is also physical evidence of just how brutal competition around a carcass could get. Paleontologists studying dire wolf teeth from La Brea have found extremely high rates of tooth breakage and heavy wear, patterns consistent with animals aggressively crunching through bone to extract every last calorie during lean periods, and possibly a sign of intense competition at kill sites where dire wolves fought off other dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and giant short-faced bears for access to a single carcass. Some researchers argue this suggests dire wolves scavenged more than modern wolves typically do. Others point to their relatively gracile limb bones, built more for pursuit than demolition work, and argue they were active predators first, opportunistic scavengers second. There is even isotope evidence that dire wolves along the ancient California coastline occasionally scavenged on beached whale carcasses, a genuinely strange image, a pack of Ice Age wolves working over a whale on a Pacific beach. Eventually, of course, the dire wolf disappeared. The most recent confirmed radiocarbon dates on dire wolf fossils from La Brea land at roughly 11,800 years ago, right around the tail end of the last ice age. This was not an isolated event, but part of a massive continent-wide collapse, sometimes called the Quaternary extinction, in which roughly 90 genera of large mammals across North America vanished in a geologically short window. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American lions, saber-toothed cats, and the horses and camels dire wolves depended on for food all disappeared together. The leading explanation is not that dire wolves were simply outcompeted by rival predators, though gray wolves may have played some role. It is that the entire food web underneath them collapsed. Rapid climate warming reshaped vegetation across the continent, and the giant herbivores that had thrived there could not adapt fast enough. Once the mammoths, horses, and giant bison that dire wolves relied on became scarce, an enormous predator built specifically for taking down enormous prey had nowhere left to turn. And because they could not interbreed their way into the gray wolf gene pool, there was no backdoor survival option either. When the megafauna died, the dire wolf had nothing left to eat and nowhere left to hide genetically. Which brings the story to April of 2025 and the moment dire wolves came roaring back into public conversation. A biotechnology company called Colossal Biosciences announced, with an enormous media rollout involving Time magazine and an exclusive with The New Yorker, that it had successfully brought the dire wolf back from extinction. 3 wolf pups named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi were unveiled to the world with striking white fur and noticeably large frames. Colossal's scientists had extracted ancient DNA fragments from dire wolf fossils, then used CRISPR gene editing technology to alter 20 specific genes in modern gray wolf cells, nudging those genes toward the dire wolf versions the ancient DNA revealed. They then used a cloning technique called somatic cell nuclear transfer, essentially inserting the edited genetic material into an egg cell and implanting the resulting embryos into domestic dog surrogates. The announcement triggered immediate, sharp pushback from the scientific community. And this is the part of the story most viewers never actually hear, because it rarely makes it past the initial celebratory headlines. Paleoecologists pointed out that changing a relative handful of genes cannot undo 5 to 6 million years of independent evolution. A wolf genome contains many thousands of genes. Editing a few dozen of them can shift coat color, body size, and skull shape, producing an animal that superficially resembles the extinct species, but it does not reconstruct the actual evolutionary lineage that vanished 11,000 years ago. Multiple scientists, including a paleoecologist from the University of Maine, publicly stated that Colossal had not actually revived a dire wolf at all. The more accurate description several geneticists suggested is that Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi are dire wolf-like gray wolves, an engineered approximation built on a genetic scaffold that remains underneath the edits, a modern gray wolf. It is worth noting the fictional dire wolves from Game of Thrones directly inspired both the look Colossal engineered and the publicity strategy behind the reveal, right down to reported collaboration with the show's original author, a detail that blurs the line between genuine paleontological achievement and carefully engineered biotech theater. So here is the fuller picture the version museums are only now catching up to. A dire wolf is not a slightly oversized gray wolf. It is a completely separate branch of the canine family tree that quietly evolved in isolation somewhere in the Americas for millions of years, converging on a wolf-like body simply because that shape works extremely well for chasing down large prey, in the same way that dolphins and sharks converged on similar streamlined bodies despite an entirely separate evolutionary history. It ranged from northern China to South America. It was represented by thousands of fossils sitting in museum drawers for over a century before anyone extracted usable DNA from them. It could not interbreed its way out of extinction. And its modern pop culture revival is, biologically speaking, a persuasive impersonation rather than a genuine resurrection. The dire wolf spent 100 years being misclassified by bone shape alone, and it took a handful of fragile, tar-soaked genetic samples to finally tell the true story, hiding underneath those deceptively familiar-looking skeletons.